This is FreshEd, a weekly podcast that makes complex ideas in educational research easily understood. I'm your host, Will Brehm. Today we explore the philosophy of education from global perspectives. My guest is Liz Jackson.
In some Western societies, assume that there's enough diversity, assumes that there is a diversity of ideas and values. They kind of see there's certain gender, racial, and ethnic diversity, and they think, okay, these boxes are ticked. But at the same time, every institution has its culture, and that goes for Hong Kong U, the same as it goes for Stanford, for Harvard, for Melbourne, anywhere. There is kind of a dominant culture, and I guess then the next question will be, is pluralism or diversity a core value of that?
Liz Jackson is the Karen Lo Eugene Chuang Professor in Diversity and Equity and Associate Dean Research of the Faculty of Education at the University of Hong Kong. She has a forthcoming book entitled Understanding Philosophy of Education, which will be published by Edward Elgar early in 2027. Liz Jackson, welcome to FreshEd.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I want to jump into sort of education research and philosophy of education. And one of the terms that we often use is this idea of global. And it can refer to so many different things, as you sort of were highlighting. A global approach, globally circulating policies, the very idea of globalization, or kind of the opposite, where we talk about local, and then you hear some people use the idea of glocal, where they combine global and local together. How do you understand the various meanings of the term global in education?
I think you're right. I think in education, there is a tendency to think of global in terms of what is international and the processes of globalization, which could be related to the importance of global influences in different regions. So very geographical, sort of nation-state-based perspective. But often this perspective somehow overlooks what remains local. Another way to think about global is to think about the big picture of education. So by global, it could be a synonym for holistic approach. So with the rise of academic fields in education, we tend to think about education in terms of schooling. And in this case, we ignore what we would call today lifelong learning. We ignore vocational education, traditional education, apprenticeship, anything outside of schools, like the null curriculum, which we learn in society, but we don't learn in schools. So in my work, I discuss the media, I discuss emotions. The media educates, but it's not part of schools. We learn about emotions, but that's not part of the curriculum. So when we look at the big picture, we can see that international differences are still important, while there tends to be this view that the global is what makes us all the same, if that makes sense.
You could think of like international education and the PISA rankings, which are school-based examinations of 15-year-olds around the geographic world where we think of nation-states. But what you're bringing up are slightly different ideas of how we might begin to start thinking about education globally.
Right, yeah. So if we look at PISA, if we look at math education, secondary education, it somehow gives the view all's the same, which makes it easy to compare things which are similar, but you then somehow hide the things which are maybe radically different.
One of the things that you point out in some of your work is how there's these major handbooks and encyclopedias that we see being produced by big publishers like Routledge or whatever it is. And they often have the term international in the title of the book, the International Handbook of X or Y or Z. And then if you look at actually who's contributing and who's writing to these books, these are often people from Western Europe or North America. A lot of the references are to similar scholars in geographic areas. Why do you think this gap sort of exists?
It's a great question, and it's one of those things that once you notice it, you can't stop noticing it, but before you see it, you just sort of take it for granted. It's an important question because I think the leaders of the field are not being closed-minded or disingenuous in their approach. And here, too, there could potentially be some differences between philosophy of education and comparative education, but I think we tend to think of our field as the people we interact with. And so comparative education, one thing that I appreciated about it and compare with philosophy is it tends to be people who like to travel and learn from different locations. Now, philosophers tend to be more oriented towards the society they're in. And historically, they don't necessarily care about meeting with people from around the world. They might have a very deep argument with someone who, lives in the same region that they live in, and it's a very conceptual argument. So they don't necessarily realize they have to travel broadly. If you think about the history of higher education, it's only in the last 20 years that it became normal for a lot of academics to travel in certain regions of the world. And of course, that's still we have to ask, again, is it global or not? Well, probably not. Probably it's only these wealthy countries where people were traveling around. But I think people tend to think about the field in terms of their conference. So, CIES, or in philosophy of education, a conference in the US or the UK. And they think of the international field in terms of the people who would travel to the US or UK for the conference. And actually, they can be quite oblivious that there's wonderful organizations based in Japan, based in Korea, based in other parts of the world, because they take for granted that the field is who they see and who they're connected with. And there's really still a lack of global knowledge. I think with the rise of the internet, there's more awareness that there are conferences around the world, but people still tend to be regional in their thoughts and think, there's one person from Korea at my conference, there's one person from China in my conference. That sort of ticks all the boxes. But, if you're in another part of the world, the field will look completely different. And then you get into the problem of the topics. Not only, as you mentioned, references can often be based in certain parts of the world, but as a result of that, certain topics will be more popular. So the Chinese scholars going to CIES are interested in issues in, US education, perhaps, rather than Chinese education. So all of this kind of goes together to paint this picture that the global field and the Western field are basically the same thing.
If you were to start looking more regionally, how do you start mapping the different ideas that you see in these different parts of the world? Because obviously that sort of Western idea in the US, North America, Western Europe, like what ideas are sort of prevalent today in the philosophy of education in those parts of the world, and how does that compare to other regions of the world? Do we see similar ideas, or are the ideas sort of different?
So this is an interesting question because it gets to the relationship between scholars in different regions, their relationships with one another, and then the way that they reflect on their own identities. What I find when I go to philosophy of education conference in Korea or Japan, for example, what I'll find is there'll be sort of international work, which is Western, and then work which might be focused on local topics. And there'll be actually kind of a divide between the two. So I might like to actually see this at AERA or CIES. Like, okay, this is the American section, this is the global section. But it's sort of more peripheral in the case of the US, isn't it? Where if you're not part of the majority, you look a bit out of place. But often, part of this big picture, too, is the English-speaking world versus the whole world beyond English. So, in our Comparative Education Society of Hong Kong, we'll have Chinese language sections. So you might find, and my understanding in speaking with some of my colleagues who are really globally oriented in East Asia, is for them, they'll go to one session in Korean talking about Korean philosophy in Korean schools, and then they'll go to another session talking about European thinkers and so-called universal or global topics. But it seems like sometimes there is a gap between the two. So you're sort of locally focused or globally focused, and then global seems to suggest Western and UK and US and Europe rather than Africa or South America or something like that.
It sounds rather segregated in a way.
I think it is. And I think one thing that inspired me to start reflecting on these issues was experiencing these things for the first time myself personally and realizing, okay, when I look at this handbook of the international field of blah, 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 I realize that they're missing out on this whole other conversation. And, on the one hand, I can judge them and say, well, that's really discriminatory of you or closed-minded of you. But I think, honestly, there's just these disconnects and these gaps in the field. And I sort of feel sorry for those colleagues who don't know that there's really interesting philosophical conversations conversation going on in the world they're just oblivious to.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely an ignorance, I would imagine. But then there's this, like, to use the term international, to claim that what you're doing is international is a bit maybe arrogant in a way.
Yeah, I think so. I think philosophers really have to think through this, but I think comparativists also have to think through this. If you're global or international, and it's only societies which are English speaking or considered Western, liberal Democrat or something like that, then it sends a message. So it sends a message that the rest of the world is not part of the world, that the rest of the world is invisible and doesn't matter. And I don't think those people are meaning to do that, but that's the result.
And what about like higher education internationalization, where students have been, circulating around the globe, but often to certain countries, right? Not every country is sort of a host country. Does that shape sort of the conversations and the traditions in which a scholar might be able to engage in or think they should engage in?
So what's really inspired me, I think, first realizing how many interesting conversations were going on around the world, that communities are not linking up to each other, even though we say that we're in a global situation, is also seeing the way that ideas move globally, because they do move globally. But one of the metaphors I used in my upcoming book is this idea of center and periphery. So what we find is there are more scholars coming from, if we take, you and I are both very familiar with East Asia. If we look at East Asia, okay, not many PhD students are coming to study in Korea and Japan. More students are coming from Korea and Japan and China to study in Australia, US, UK, Europe, and so on. And through that process, there's this assumption, and I think we also in this context need to give more credit to Asia in comparative education. I think in East Asia, there's an assumption that you learn from other places, and that's not a global assumption. So when they show up in the US, there's this expectation you have to learn from the colleagues in the US. There's not the expectation that the US colleagues have something to learn from their students. And then they eventually, ideas that they learned in the US or UK or Australia, they bring them back to Japan or Korea or China, and that sort of becomes the knowledge from the world or the knowledge from the West. But you don't see that as much, that movement of ideas going the other way as often. And I've also noticed this, in Hong Kong, where I am, in Korea and Japan, there's this culture of hospitality to invite in scholars from around the world. Again, it's not just Western, but just around the world. Thank you for coming. You're from Africa, you're from Ukraine, you're from Tanzania, you're from US, welcome here. And that culture of hospitality is less deeply grained in a lot of Western liberal societies. So even a top scholar will come from China or Korea to the US, and everyone's like, are you here for something? Do you want something from us? Rather than, wow, we have something to learn from you.
A lot of what we're talking about is around geography and coming from different places and how these local contexts matter to thought and shape thinking. I guess since you are a philosopher of education, I mean, to what extent can thought be sort of universal or abstracted beyond the local or have nothing to do with the local, like where it is a universal thought that you can sort of work with rather than a thought that comes specifically from some geography?
So this is a really hot topic you've touched on in philosophy, and this is one reason why people will sort of puzzle when I say that philosophy of education needs to become more global or globalized from a certain perspective. There is the idea that there's this methodology called conceptual analysis. And in conceptual analysis, you're looking at these concepts which could be abstracted from any culture, and it's seen as this methodology that could be universal in the sense that it doesn't matter where you are. So if you take two concepts that I like to work on recently are gratitude and humility. So if you think about gratitude, you can sort of come up with this definition that would make sense to anybody, anywhere. And then you can say, okay, this is a, something, and in fact, people do say this is a universal value, this is a universal concept. So there's two interesting things that happen here, I think, when it comes to this idea of universal concept. The first interesting thing is, do people around the world think about universal concepts or not? Or is this sort of part of a Western philosophy? And I think that there is a misconception that that's something people do more in Western philosophy communities than globally. And I don't know why there's this misconception, because Chinese philosophers also think about concepts. This is not something distinctive to a particular region. But the other issue is, if you assume that, okay, the concept that matters to you is important to everyone around the world. So that's a slightly different issue. So everyone around the world can understand your concept. Everyone in the world has concepts. But if we have sort of 3 or 4 different ways to think about gratitude, if you're saying that you have the best view, does that mean it's the best view for people in China, for people in Tanzania? And I think there's a really important question there about, are you then implying that everyone needs to share values that come from one region? And the people who are doing this work, which I want to problematize, they're not really thinking about it that way, because they don't understand that their ideas are influenced by their culture. And so that's another reason why it would be so valuable for people to be more globally interconnected than they are in philosophy, is because people, I think often they don't realize how culture influences their thinking until they meet someone with a different view. And a philosopher might say, well, that's why we argue with people in the same city as us, because even people in the same city as us have different views. But if you leave your city, if you leave your region and go around the world, you'll find different views that were not at all common in your own country. And then you'll start to realize, okay, you have a universal concept, but it's more important to people in the UK than it is in China.
Yeah, universal concepts, but sort of particular interpretations or sort of moments in time, maybe? Maybe there's something about a temporal dimension here around some of these concepts than when a universal idea sort of gets taken up or not. I guess this raises sort of this question around the philosophy of education more sort of broadly. Is that field in and of itself a Western field? Is there an assumption that the philosophy that we're talking about when we say philosophy of education as being sort of, a Western European, North American sort of construct?
Yes, this is a question that I've been thinking a lot about, and a lot of my colleagues have been thinking about. And this was actually one of the first responses I got from some of my peers when I started saying, you're saying your handbook is international, but there's no one talking about Confucianism in it, so what's going on? And a few colleagues actually said, well, philosophy is Western, so it comes from Western philosophy, and then it's philosophy of education that makes it Western. And the longer I think about it, the less sense that makes. So we can think about this claim from an empirical view or from a conceptual view, what is philosophy? So some people will say philosophy is based on the activities that were going on in ancient Greece, with Socrates and Plato and Aristotle being the fathers of philosophy. So a lot of people have said that. So if I look at what those guys were doing, they were giving lectures. They were thinking about big questions about reality, about life, about what's good or bad. They're debating, they're dialoguing, they're telling jokes, they're telling stories, they're imagining crazy situations, they're making often ridiculous arguments. Okay, people around the world, across thought traditions and history, were doing things like that. So I don't really see... I think they need to make the point that philosophy is Western. They need to be able to say there's some kind of activity that they were doing which people weren't doing elsewhere. And I've seen some people gesturing at this, but I don't find any real evidence. So there's sort of, okay, what is philosophy? What's the concept? And then what are the activities? And on both sides, I think the same things that Socrates and Plato and Aristotle were doing, I think Confucius and his buddies were also doing. The one other thing people will say is philosophy of education and philosophy itself is Western because the word philosophy comes from ancient Greece. And I think that's a kind of silly argument to make. So if that's true, then that means that tofu is Chinese, and if you have tofu outside of China, then it's not tofu, or you can't have yoga outside of India. To me, if you want to make that argument, it's kind of a pedantic and annoying argument, but When you're talking about this topic in the context of the history of Western supremacy and these ongoing manifestations where global scholars are still treated inferior to other scholars, like, why would you make such a pedantic and annoying point, which is not really relevant, which has a negative real-world impact? So it makes it a harmful view. So that's why I really want to challenge this view.
I mean, maybe this is a good point to sort of turn to some practical philosophy, if we could say that. And maybe from your own practice as being a philosopher in education and working on different concepts. Like, how do you take a supposedly universal idea and sort of, recognize that it came from your own thinking, your own experiences in a particular context? And how do you kind of see if it works elsewhere, right? Like, how do you actually go about doing that?
Well, one thing that I have mentioned in my work, but I still need to think more about, and maybe this is something you can help me think about in the future, is I've discussed this idea of field testing. And this is something philosophers and psychologists that I've worked with do. So when it comes to humility or gratitude, ask normal people in society what they think about it. Ask what their associations are with it. So they've done that with gratitude. So if you ask people in the US and the UK and Australia, by the way, you might find it quite interesting. Normal people in those contexts will describe the term differently. Gratitude in the US is associated with being like super happy. A lot of terms are associated with being super happy in the US. In Australia and the UK, people have more mixed emotions. They might feel embarrassed, for example. So this makes a difference if you want to create a global curriculum, or if you want to bring a curriculum. Oh, this curriculum on gratitude worked really well in the UK, so let's bring it to Australia. And in fact, there is research that shows that that doesn't often work the way people want it to do. A looser way to think about field testing, this is something I encourage our colleagues in my work as Associate Dean Research, and I encourage my students to do, is really just think about who's the audience for your work. Will this work be interesting to someone around the world? And you don't just have to think about it. Talk to someone, have them read your article, have them read your literature review. Okay, does this have anything to do with people and schools, right? Because schools are also still different in different parts of the world. Is this relevant or not? How could I make this relevant? But it is still a methodological challenge and something to think through more for sure.
And what about like the ability to tap into academic literature that's written in a language that you don't speak?
Yeah, so this is a really tough challenge. And a lot of the challenges here, actually, if we sat down with someone who is an expert in linguistics, I mean, there's a whole linguistic dimension to all of this. So a lot of my colleagues will say another reason why Western scholars are not aware of excellent work in other fields is that it's not in English. And people are having amazing conversations in other languages. And some people have suggested that maybe AI can help with this, but I'm not sure it can, because there tends to be this tendency to conflate concepts. So something Chinese philosophers think a lot about, is there a way to translate a term? A lot of the key terms really aren't that easy to translate. So this really throws off the whole project of conceptual analysis. If you think about the challenge of translation, I think this is where it becomes really important to actually collaborate with people. And a lot of the recent work I've done, there's no doubt about it that it's really benefited for me becoming closer with and collaborating with people who come from different backgrounds than I'd come from. Yeah.
And another practical question that I have is around supervision. You brought up students, and you and I both teach students probably from kind of all over the world, right? Students travel the globe to go to places like Hong Kong University. And, if you're working with a student that comes from contexts that you don't really know anything about, how do you supervise them? How do you encourage them to sort of explore these different knowledge traditions and, philosophy from a quote unquote global perspective?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I think this is a question people are facing because on the one hand, higher education has become so global, and we're seeing that when it comes to students, but it's a different world than the world that a lot of us grew up in, which was not global. And there are still global differences. So just because we meet each other doesn't mean we have the same experience, because there are regional and global differences. So for me, it was interesting because when I first got to HKU, when I first started my job there, whenever there was a strong student who came from a different country that other people were not familiar with, they would actually send them my way because they just think, well, Liz has lived in South Africa, so she can take Tanzania. Liz has done work about Islam, so she can take a student from Bangladesh. And I was happy to take up that challenge to work with talented students. I think there's a general challenge working with students in such a way that you don't want to dismiss their knowledge and their experience. So what I mean by that is the way that I think about doctoral supervision, my goal is not to create little mini-me's, like everyone's work is derivative upon my own work. My view is that each student has their own vision, and it's my goal to try to bring that out. But this is not an easy thing to do because they might have difficulty expressing it to me. Actually, sometimes I find if a student cares about a topic a great deal, they especially have difficulty sharing it, and expressing it and translating it. Some things are difficult to translate. So I see it as a kind of dialogue to try to bring out that creativity and that inspiration from students. And so that's my goal, is really to bring out their vision and to help them bring out their vision and help them make a bridge between their vision, their experience, their knowledge, their perspective, and the global, whatever we mean by global, the sort of broader field, so that they can connect their insights and their knowledge that they've gained to a broader community.
One of the things I feel like I experience pretty much every semester I teach is students who speak other languages. They sort of ask me for permission to use articles and books that were written languages they speak that are not English. And it's like, are we allowed to do this? And I'm always like, this is a great resource that you can actually use. How do you approach that? Do you get the same sort of question from students as well?
I do. And I agree with you that it's a surprising question from my perspective, because of course, if they're interested in a certain region or culture, that's going to come up. I have a related issue which has sort of been becoming more and more prevalent in my working with students, which is that now I ask them and encourage them to think about, so if they come from the Chinese mainland and they love European philosophy, what does European philosophy have to do with the situation in China? And I get pretty interesting responses to this, and this brings up a whole other interesting conversation, because on the one hand, they shouldn't be geographically limited. They shouldn't be forced to study Confucius or Buddhism just because they came from China. If they love Levinas, if they love John Dewey, it's not right for me to say, based on my philosophy of supervision, don't look at John Dewey, you're Chinese, so you're not allowed to do that, or something like that. But I do want to push them because of this global inequality historically. I really do want to push them, because what I find is a lot of the students don't know much about their local tradition. So some students have been taught over time in informal ways, the best scholarship is Western, the best ideas come from Europe and North America, and indirectly that message is, there's nothing good from where you're from. Same with my students who come from Africa. They mostly come from East Africa. I say, okay, what's important that comes from this region? Not to just use theories and perspectives and philosophies coming from Europe, because those might be completely unrelated. So students often say they want to use Bronfenbrenner's ecological framework to look at relationships in China. And to me, there's so many things which a Confucian perspective illuminates about relationships in China, which Bronfenbrenner's framework, it almost hides them or obscures them. But in any case, why would Bronfenbrenner have more to say about education in China than Confucianism? So I feel compelled to push students, and I have had some students say, I didn't realize that I had a local tradition and I could benefit from thinking about that. So it's a tough balance, actually.
By way of conclusion, I want to sort of broaden the conversation here about beyond students and the supervision that you do to push students beyond seeing, the best ideas come from the West. What about the academy more generally? Like, how do we move the academy and all its various activities and institutions, to move beyond the idea that the West knows best or that the global equals West? How do we do it?
This is a great question. It's one I've been thinking about, because what tends to happen in my experience, so I've been pushing this message for a while, is people in some Western societies assume that there's enough diversity, assumes that there is a diversity of ideas and values, that they kind of see there's certain gender, racial, and ethnic diversity, and they think, okay, these boxes are ticked. But at the same time, every institution has its culture. And that goes for Hong Kong U, the same as it goes for Stanford, for Harvard, for Melbourne, anywhere. There is kind of a dominant culture. And I guess then the next question will be, is pluralism or diversity a core value of that? And this is where we get into more thorny questions. What does pluralism or diversity mean? But I think for a lot of people, there needs to be taking a step back and looking at the situation and looking at who is and is not included in different ways. So something I notice in conferences, for example, is every conference has its norms around how you're eating. So I notice when I go to Australia and New Zealand, people love to eat finger food. And, for personal reasons, I don't love to eat finger food. So then some countries, love to eat finger food, some don't. So that's just a really simple example. But all of these things can add up in such a way that it can actually become very uncomfortable for someone who comes from a country and context that has a lot of cultural traditions and distinctions to feel very uncomfortable and pressured. And I've heard of colleagues from China going to conferences in the UK and people saying, get with the program, you have to do it this way, as if that person who came from China is being rude to them. So I think people need to step back and see how they do have a culture. What they say is global is also a culture. So in our Faculty of Education at Hong Kong U, we think about, do we want to have tea before meetings or after meetings? How eating food can bring people together in a different way. But also, what are those rituals? I mean, and there is sort of the trope as well, the women get the tea or the women get the snacks or the students get the tea or snacks. So just really looking at all of those things. And to look at all those things, you need to actually ask everyone what they think. I think it includes diverse voices in decision-making and consultation, and give them the chance to ask questions and disagree. So that really means changing, not taking for granted, okay, because I think this is what's happened in a lot of places. It's like, okay, 10 years ago, we did the whole Me Too thing, or we did a certain kind of cultural movement happen, so we did a big reform at that time, we figured it all out, but everything changes, and then we need to look at the situation again. And even for me now, I'm like, what's with the, young scholars, the young students? There are separations across generations and across cultures. And so being really thoughtful about who's involved in decision making and actually looking at the environment, not taking for granted. Because I think what happens is whatever the dean and associate deans and full professors like is considered good. And that is, really far from the full picture, actually.
Well, Liz Jackson, thank you so much for joining FreshEd. Congratulations on the forthcoming book, and thank you very much for joining again.
Thank you so much. It's been my pleasure.
Liz Jackson is a professor at the University of Hong Kong. Her forthcoming book is entitled Understanding Philosophy of Education. Please note that opinions expressed on FreshEd are solely those of the host or the guest interviewed, not FreshEd, which takes no institutional position. If you've liked what you've heard today, please rate us wherever you listen to podcasts. Reviews really do help. FreshEd's team includes Fatih Akhtas, Obafemi Ngunle, Phyllis Che-Mensa, and Jose Neto. Original music for FreshEd was created by Digital Primate. FreshEd is an independently run podcast and is made possible by listeners like you. Please consider donating to FreshEd by visiting freshedpodcast.com/support. Thanks for listening. I'm Will Brehm, and I'll be back next week.